Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to the Sustainable Jungle podcast. I'm Joy, and today I'm thrilled to be talking to Carl Gish, a seasoned leader in the fields of marketing, product management, and now a visionary in sustainable home building. Carl is the co-founder and co-CEO of Aro Homes, a company that's revolutionizing residential construction with its carbon negative, beautiful, and efficient homes. As always, you can find the show notes for this episode over on sustainablejungle.com/podcast. Now, let's talk construction disruption with Carl Gish. Carl, welcome to our show. Now, before we dive into the work that you're doing with Aro Homes, let's get to know you a little bit better. Can you tell us a little bit more about where you were born and where you grew up?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Connecticut, which is on the east coast of the United States, and I grew up in a large old home that was, by today's standards, incredibly environmentally unfriendly. They had taken a cold furnace and converted it to an oil burner. And if you had an infrared satellite looking down on it today, it would probably be a horrendous plume of redness. But I started my career early on in product management at Unilever in New York City, lived in New York for on and off for many years, and expanded from product development, product management at Unilever into e-commerce, worked at Amazon and eBay, and also at Dyson, very design and product-driven companies. And then the last few years of my career I've spent in early stage companies and advising other early stage companies in a bunch of different fields, from e-commerce to fintech to actually agriculture, ag tech. So pretty broad spectrum of things I've applied my experience and skills to.
Perhaps you could share a little bit more about how these experiences, as well as some of your more early stage experiences, has helped shape and influence you.
Yeah, sure. So early on in my career, I was, for whatever reason, driven by the notion of working on products that touched people's lives. For whatever reason, I worked on soap at Unilever, and I was passionate about creating and working on creating the best soaps possible for consumers. And I was fortunate enough to work on a brand like Dove, which is arguably one of the best in the world. And I've just always had that interest in the different multifunctional aspects that are required to bring a product to market, to really understand consumer needs, end user needs, whether stated or not, and then working with the teams to then bring those things to life and to market. And I've been fortunate to do it across, as I mentioned earlier, a bunch of different industries and work with some amazing people.
It sounds like quite the career path, and has led you into this stage where you can focus on this very interesting startup at Aro Homes. So you've made the shift from being a leader at these large global corporations to working on sort of early stage, and now pioneering a sustainable home building startup. What inspired this specific change and led you to co-found Aro Homes specifically?
Yeah, I had been working on things and sort of been conscious of the impact of businesses or products I worked on for quite a while. I have a brother who's been in sustainable energy at scale for decades now: wind power, solar power, hydroelectric power. And we've always sort of sparred intellectually about how important that is and how those kinds of solutions can make it to the market. And a lot of the companies I worked at, including Plenty, for instance, which is now successfully launched some very large indoor growing facilities that are helping solve some big environmental and sustainability problems. And that's something I've been wanting to spend more and more of my time on. I've always tried to work in companies that had what I'll call sort of a net positive impact philosophy. Even a company like Unilever has been a leader for many years in sort of operating in a sustainable and responsible way. And as I was advising companies, working with Eric Schmidt's Innovation Endeavors venture capital firm, that was one of the things that was a consistently important consideration for me. Is the thing I'm working on, is the thing I'm applying my experience to, does it have the potential to have a positive impact on the earth, on people, on society? I know that may sound sort of grandiose, and it does as it's coming out of my mouth, but at the same time, I believe it's important. If I can do something, even if it's small, to help and have a positive impact, I will. And so as I was doing some advising and close to, as an advisor, the Innovation Endeavors team, one of the areas they were looking at and I got involved in was the built environment, prop tech, construction tech, et cetera. And through all the work that they'd done as investors, they had found not really a lot. They hadn't found very many companies that were that could seem to have a recipe to make a big difference on the built environment. Something I didn't realize until I started doing this research was that 23% of global carbon emissions come from residential housing. That doesn't count commercial, industrial stuff. It's just residential housing. And in the U.S., there's 86 million homes, single-family homes. So we obviously have many more residences than that. And the average age is something like 43 years right now. And if that's the average, I mean, imagine there's just a lot of old homes that were built well before Earth Day was celebrated and other things, and where they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the awareness, and that infrastructure has to be replaced, right? And it can be replaced, we felt, in a way that's way better for the environment than how we're doing it today.
And that brings us to Aro Homes. So could you tell us more about what it is and the vision behind this startup?
Yeah. So as we did this research, we started out almost as a research project, an incubation project within Innovation Endeavors. We quickly saw how inefficient and environmentally backward it seemed that single-family residential construction is. And this isn't, I mean, there's lots of smart people working on it. There's lots of well-intentioned, experienced people, but just for a bunch of reasons, which are relatively well understood, it's slow to change, and there's just a lot of inefficiency. I mean, in the US, it takes 18 plus months to redevelop a single family home, a 1 or 2 story home, 18 months. And it's very wasteful. The EPA and the Home Building Association, they sort of estimated previously that about 30 to 40% of the materials used in single family construction are wasted. And at the end of the day, I would argue the products that are built aren't as good as they could be. There's an adage in the construction industry in the U.S. that every home is a prototype. And it's kind of true. And if you think of any other product categories, particularly one as important and expensive as a home, you would never accept that as a consumer, that it was a prototype. It was made out of a kit in the lot. And so we fundamentally just think that applying a product-centric approach to this problem, bringing really intelligent design and engineering and multifunctional collaboration, we can solve it. And today we're building carbon negative, precision engineered homes, and we can do it more quickly and with less waste than how it's done today. We're completing our first home, will be sold next month within weeks. And our second and third ones will be coming quickly after that.
Gosh, very exciting.
Yeah.
And the other facet that I understand is the housing crisis. And Aro is trying to plug into that major issue. Perhaps for listeners who may not be familiar with that substantial concern, could you just tell us a little bit more about the housing crisis and how Aro is trying to tap into that issue?
Yeah, that's a very important and somewhat charged topic in a lot of places. The reality is the U.S., depending on the study, I think it's somewhere between we're short something like 5 to 6 million homes right now, and something like 1.5 million of those are in California alone. Wow. And that's homes in general. The lack of affordable housing has been well documented, and the reality is we're not purporting to be out to solve or being able to solve the U.S. housing crisis, let alone solve the affordable housing crisis. So let me be really clear. We'd love to. Oh my God, that would be such an amazing thing to solve and a legacy to have. So that isn't our ambition per se, but our ambition is to help point a way, demonstrate a way, prove a way that can help solve those big existential problems we're facing. So one of the things we talk about is our goal is to get to, our first sort of big hairy goal is to get to 1,000 homes being built a year, 1,000 carbon negative homes that can that basically offset the embedded carbon in the home within about 5 years, which is very few, if any, homes in the world today can claim that. Mm-hmm. If we do that, we'll still be a tiny drop in the bucket in terms of, the 86 million homes I mentioned. However, if we're successful and we can demonstrate a platform, an approach that can be applied by other people, and we start to influence that, that will be a huge marker of success for us. We'll be very excited if that happens. And we have every intention, we're starting at the higher end of the market in California, in Silicon Valley. We're not out to build homes for the ultra wealthy, and we're not. And there's very much a market here for homes that are green, that are well designed, that have efficient energy systems and the rest. So we think it's a smart place to start because the market demand is here. And once we built a platform and have some scale, we'll be able to apply it to a much broader footprint of homes and neighborhoods and other areas.
It's interesting, the topic of influence and how that can create a ripple effect into other industries or other builders and other industries. We had a guy on our podcast called Brendan Condon who was building not an eco village. I wouldn't have called it an eco village. It sounded like it was more like a complete redesign of a community. Some maybe about 2 hours away from Melbourne, and the idea was that all of the homes would be fully passive, similar to Aro sort of vision, and have sort of a central community hub around work from home. So you could go and work kind of like a WeWork, but within the community. You can go and work centrally, and you could have, your veggie gardens and everything. And then they would have electric buses back to the city, like the 2-hour commute back to the city if you wanted to, get on board that. And he's gone and built that. And he's made those plans for that housing and that community fully open source. So anyone can access them and build those houses in the future. So I really love that idea of sort of sharing the knowledge and expanding and influencing the industry more broadly. And I wanted to share with you that my husband Lyle and I have just built a more sustainable home. I say more sustainable because it's not by no means as sustainable as it could be, but it is absolutely more sustainable than your average home. We just moved in last week after 2.5 years of planning and building. And so the topic of home building is very much front of mind for us. I have to say that while our builder was a really good sport at putting up with our requests for things like extra insulation and new PVC frames, it's actually been a real struggle to do all the things that we would have wanted to do, including sort of more efficient design and lower carbon materials, and stay within sight of the budget. It's just not the norm, and it's still far from most builders' minds. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how Aro is approaching design and engineering and leveraging technology to change the industry to create this movement. Could you tell us more about that, and maybe also be as detailed as you like, because I'm sure listeners will be very interested in this.
Yeah, we could talk for hours of this, obviously, and I love the notion of the Echo Village and an open source platform that you talked about at the beginning, because we're actually intending to do the very same thing, and actually even start once we have some scale. We think we can work with companies like Schneider and other home systems people to collaborate on, because one of the things that a lot of companies, building manufacturer component people have is a lot of builders are risk averse. And so they won't really adopt the new technology because they don't have any incentive to do so, at least in this country, because consumers aren't willing to pay for it, and it adds risk to a contractor's livelihood. So we have a much different approach, much more similar to it sounds like what Brendan's doing. We've approached the whole, from beginning to end, the whole notion of how do you build a home, redevelop an existing home, but build a home. So we own the process end to end. We buy lots, old homes, and we essentially redevelop them and sell them, and even offer warranties, extended warranties we will be offering to the homeowners who buy our homes. And we started out with the goal of saying, hey, it should be feasible to design a home that will be very, very efficient in terms of its energy usage. And in California, essentially now by code, everything has to be electric. You can't really have any gas in the home anymore. And as efficient as possible with systems, but as livable as possible. So smart lighting, very efficient and pleasant heating and cooling systems, instant hot water. Our home is pre-wired for gray water reclamation if somebody wants to install that. Because in California, obviously, water, a lot of places these days, unfortunately, water is becoming a scarce resource. And so it starts with with intent, right? And then working with a bunch of smart designers and architects and engineers to look at what the different systems out there. So I mentioned before, multifunctional collaboration. That's critical, we think. And again, it goes back to a product approach. We start with, okay, what's our goal? What's the product requirements? What's the product brief, if you will? And then we work collaboratively to say, okay, how can we achieve that? What are the trade-offs between cost and the whatever benefit that is? How much insulation makes sense to offset any kind of energy usage? How much solar should we have to generate a net negative operating carbon footprint? And our house is packed with sort of, I want to say bleeding edge, but sort of the latest kind of system. So a heat pump, high velocity air handler, electric water heater, convection electric stove and ovens. As I mentioned, it's pre-wired for gray water reclamation. It has about a 9 kilowatt PV system with using a span panel, really smart panel to help actually, because the home has PV and batteries, it can be off the grid, and we can energize or optimize energy usage for when the grid is least or most expensive, right? So we can use the batteries that are charged from solar at peak hours and not have to tap into the grid's energy, which in California is very, very expensive at peak hours. We're talking like over 50 cents a kilowatt hour. Wow. Yeah, crazy. And what they're doing now is they'll only give you 5 cents for renewable energy you push back to the grid, net metering, 5 cents, but they're going to charge 10x that at peak hours. So you really do need to start using batteries and manage your own energy, sort of be your own energy, sort of discrete energy system, which is way more efficient these days in California. So it's really that process of collaborating, multidisciplinary, trying to get the best of systems out there that have the best cost-benefit relationship. And, our first one, as I mentioned, is going up in 3 weeks. The certificate of occupancy will be complete. And we're at about 16 to 17 years to offset the embedded footprint of the house, the embedded carbon footprint. And one of the things, too, is, and this is, people talk about net zero homes. So they're generating more energy than use. But if you have the equivalent of 100 tons of carbon that went into building your home because you didn't make particularly disciplined or intentful choices about how you built it, the net footprint of that home build will always be negative. It'll be a net drag on the carbon footprint or the carbon situation. So I don't know whether does that sort of get it? What you were?
Yeah. As you say, there's so much to unpack. You could talk about it for hours, and I'd love to ask very specific questions. Having spent a lot of time talking about the detail of this sort of stuff for our own home. But one thing that I really loved and would love to talk to you more about is the 3D modeling and using that technology, because we on our block, I tried to position the design of the house such that we get the light the morning light all the way through, and most of the windows are
Mm,
sort of north facing, and then we get like the west sun. But that was because I insisted on doing that, and I
mm.
had no idea what I was doing, and I had to try and like push it to be what I thought made sense, just logically. But I understand that you can actually use 3D modeling now to figure out what the light's going to do and how that's going to plug into your energy efficiency as well. Um, is that going to be a standard feature, and how does that work? Maybe you could share a little bit more about that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Light is something I love to think about and talk about, because one of the things that, again, starting this process, it hadn't occurred to me that how important natural light is to us as humans, right? I mean, for
Right.
thousands, millions of years, we've evolved to react to light during the day, and it is not constant. It is very different. The morning, the middle of the day, the evening, and our bodies, our well-being is affected by it. And today, what we have generally is either natural light or a binary, either LED or fluorescent light. And so, one of the things we're actually including in our house is the ability to have, and this is now it's partly because of the IoT and just technology costs coming down and all the rest of it, that diurnal lighting that can be the actual characteristics of the light and how we will react to it. You can adjust it during the day, right? You
Wow.
can do that automatically. So that's something I'm really looking forward to expanding and exploring. Like, hey, how can we give people, a home that will actually improve their well-being? So that's super exciting. Specifically around the natural light, we partnered with a world-class architect. We haven't announced who that is, even though we've been working with them for a year. We're actually going to do that later this month or early next month when we complete and sell the first home. But they very, very intentional about sight lines, light coming in. We have multiple almost floor to ceiling windows and window panels in the home. And so natural light, particularly in a place like California,
Right.
and open indoor outdoor sort of contiguous space, taking advantage because we're able to live outside so much of the year here, particularly in the sort of Mountain View area, Bay Area. Taking advantage of that just makes a ton of sense.
Mhm.
And the other thing that we're doing particularly around 3D design, is we're not just modeling in 3D. We actually have a fully detailed 3D model of the house. It's essentially a digital twin of the house. So
Wow.
everything down to the last staple that's used on the 12 gauge wire in the eave under the kitchen cabinet is literally modeled with a part number that's tied into our ERP system, which you would never, ever do that for a single family home. You barely do it for big commercial buildings. And the reason we're doing that, one is because it ties into our model. We're going to build essentially the same home over and over again. So I mentioned earlier, in the US at least, every house is essentially a prototype. That you take a set of plans, you put it on the sawhorses, and the contractor and the GC build it, and then somebody goes and does a very, very, very similar thing, but essentially from scratch, down the street, next door, next town over. And so there's just almost a Groundhog Day kind of thing here, as opposed to saying,
Yeah.
wait, a 4-bedroom, 1 office/bedroom, 3-bathroom house with 1-car garage and open living space. Like, how different does it need to be on the actual structure and the rest of it? So instead of having sort of 5% customized or different, we're focusing on just an amazing design and then repeating that over and over again. So we can invest that much more. It would never make economic sense for somebody to spend what we spent on a single home, unless you were just fabulously wealthy and had time on your hands, um, which most of us aren't. And
Yeah.
but because we're going to do this house dozens, 100 times, or some version of it, we're able to do that. And so that gives us the ability to actually do design and then iterate on that design, just like any product. So we'll go and spend time with the first family that lives in our house. We might even ask them to journal things that they love and things that they might have wanted to do differently, or what they use the most, what they use the least. And we can then take that and iterate it into the next rev of our design.
I love that. That scale, using that scale to really drive that efficiency. It just
Exactly.
makes so much sense. And one small thing you mentioned, that the even down to the wiring under the sink. Like, I read that the 3D software modeling will help reduce the copper wiring and plumbing. So it's not just about efficiency in terms of sort of financial or the cost to build the house, but the actual resources that go into the build will be reduced as well, which obviously has an impact, more broadly from a sustainability perspective.
Absolutely. Just stacking things, stacking, and this is people do this already, but maybe not as deliberately or as thoughtfully as we're doing it, because the stacking of things like the systems, MEP and the plumbing and the HVAC, and so that the runs for the wires, for the conduits, for the plumbing are as short as possible. There's lots of benefits to that, not just materials, but just installation, maintenance, and also customer experience, right? Just, stuff doesn't have to travel as far to get to where you need it.
And maybe this is obvious from what you've said already, but all this rethinking has really helped cut that building process from 18 months to 90 days, as you've said. And that makes me feel a little weak at the knees, having just been through a really long build. But maybe you can explain a bit more of how that translates, how these design changes have translated into such a reduction in time frame.
Yeah, it's something. We're not at 90 days. I'll be perfectly frank. That is, we have line of sight to how we're going to do it. Our second home will be about 150, which is still,
Still amazing.
multiple times shorter, and it really has to do with the approach that we started. Part of it goes back to the design. So because we're building the same home over and over again, and because we're building a lot of it off-site, we can do multiple things at once. So we can be building the foundation while we're building the house. We can permit the house almost while we're building it, because we're building it off-site,
Right.
it's subject to state permitting and inspection, not the local jurisdictions.
Right.
In California and in most states in the United States, anything that's built off-site is considered manufactured housing. Sometimes it's called prefab, other names. Ours, it's not. Yes, it's prefabricated, but it's not. It's really more pre-construction or off-site construction in our case, and that allows us to parallelize the process. And because our house is essentially the same, what happens today in redevelopment, people, builders, owners will buy a piece of land that they or their own piece of land, and then they'll design a house, then they will permit that house, and then they'll build that house.
Right.
And that's part of what takes that 18 to 24 months is just how long the permitting process is, the design process. We're basically turning that on its head. We buy lots, old homes that need to be end of life, that fit our home. So we already have the home before we even bought a piece of land.
Yeah.
We already have the home designed. We already have the home permitted, and we can almost have the home built. So all we have to do then is do the local permit, scrape the lot, and then bring the modules, their sort of prefabricated components, and bring them and stitch them and set them. And one of the things about our home is we didn't start with a modular sort of, hey, we've got some modules and we want to put them together into a home, because they're standard modules, and we've got a bedroom mod and a kitchen mod and a blah. We decided to design a house. As I mentioned, we have this really amazing world-class architect who's built very famous buildings and facilities. We said, what's an amazing house that we can put in this footprint? A 4.5 bedroom, 3,000 square foot house. What could that look like that meets all these requirements about environmental impact, sight lines, livability? Once we had that design, then we did a process of, hey, how could we build this off-site and then transport modules or transport components and bring it together quickly on a location where we've built a foundation? So it's sort of a very deliberate process that thinks about end to end. And that's the only way, frankly, we can get to the 90-day target, which we're actually the second home. We've already made so much progress, and we'll see more and more on the third. So getting to 120 days by our third or fourth home, we feel is absolutely achievable. Getting from 120 to 90, that's going to take a lot of work, but we'll do it.
That's when you get scale, right? When you really add scale.
Exactly.
Yeah. Gosh, it's unbelievable to think. And it just makes so much sense. We spent a year and a half in design and planning, and then a year build, just over a year to build. And that it just felt so much wasted time and so much inefficiency in the system. It's actually, when you hear it explained like that, it's just a no-brainer that it should be the way that things are done. And then the other advantage, I imagine, of manufacturing offsite and manufacturing the same thing over and over again, aside from the sort of general efficiency, is the waste. I imagine you're able to limit waste substantially. I mean, like when I was horrified to see how much waste came out of our build.
Yeah, you're 100% right, Troy. I mean, we call them dumpsters. They're those big metal containers that come on and off the truck. And I've had work done in my house. If you live next to anybody who has work done, those things fill up and they replace them several times during a build. And it's literally just scrap because they buy a 12-foot 2x4 and only need 7 feet. And yeah, they might use some of the 5-foot remnant, but probably not. And then all the wire, all the plumbing, all the sheetrock, everything. And partly this is the strange part. There are what I call structural disincentives. Nobody means to do all that waste, but jobs are generally bid as time and materials. And so the sub and the GC, they're going to pass that cost along to you. And they're not incented to reduce waste. Not really. I mean, obviously nobody wants to create waste, hopefully, but it's almost what I'll call a structural disincentive. Just like unless the plumber and the carpenter or the plumber and the electrician happen to know each other or just very are they really going to collaborate and make sure that the work they're doing is really thoughtful for the person who needs to come before or after them? I don't know. I've seen in my own projects where maybe some shortcuts are taken that, hey, if you were part of a team that had pride of ownership in this actual end product, that might not happen. So there's just so many benefits to doing it sort of offsite and the same thing and over again. And you mentioned the planning. Yeah, think about it. Those design sets that every day are going in and out of every town's planning department. And how different are those actual bedrooms, bathrooms, homes? Not that different, right?
No.
But every time it's a new plan set, it's a new whatever. So that's one of we just think there's going to be tons of advantages to this approach. And it's not going to work for everybody or everything. But again, with 86 million homes in the U.S., the average being 40-something years, and a shortage of 5 or 6 million homes, we're building in the U.S. about 1 million homes a year. And I don't think we're building them that much better than we were 80 to 100 years ago.
Yeah, you've got to imagine that a big chunk of those can be massively improved from a standardization perspective. And reduce efficiency in the entire way along the value chain, which is incredible. And as you say, it's not going to work for everyone. Like we were on a very steep slope, so I imagine a home that's it's not going to work for a steep slope unless you come up with a steep slope design at some point. Maybe that will be you'll have different sort of models for different types of blocks down the line, and then that makes it a little bit more achievable for different. But most blocks are just standard size and standard. And it's easy to just put the same, more efficient home on each block. So yeah, you can get a big chunk of that million number covered by this model, I would imagine.
Yeah, 100%. And also just like building in the plant, it's a light, safe environment where you got a team of people who are working together, have pride of ownership in a product. They all have equity in the company. Everybody in our company is an owner, literally, because we believe that drives engagement and literally ownership, right, of results and of culture and the rest of it. And one of the things that's really been interesting, because my co-CEO is a guy who spent 25 years in automotive manufacturing, and the safety of the culture of safety is super important to us. And so in our facility, we actually just announced this last week, we've been a year without any incident, any lost time incident or anything else. And we track and measure that, including lean principles, regularly. It's just part of the culture and discipline of the company. And then when we go off-site, we go to the actual site, and how things are done there. And it's been very hard. It's been very frustrating for some of the team, because there's no culture of safety. They don't wear hard hats. They don't wear eye protection. And so there's we're having to think about, okay, how do we help train these people? Because yes, it slows things down, but if you're thoughtful about it, you build it into your process, you can absolutely have the same output and still be safe, right? And not have back injuries or eye injuries or limb injuries, which ultimately hurt. They hurt your livelihood. They're just avoidable badness that we're trying to do. So there's just lots of benefits by doing more of it, and not to mention quality control, right? I mean,
for sure.
the thing I mentioned before, it's like we have QC in our plant. So if the sheathing on a wall isn't done to spec, it's going to get redone. If the caulking on a tile isn't done to spec, we're going to redo it, and we're going to catch it. And it's much more efficient and less expensive to catch it than when you're doing a punch list with an owner or something, right?
Sure.
So there's so far that we've seen tons of benefits, and we'll see more and more.
The safety one is so interesting. I remember when we were making sort of decisions on what we wanted in terms of things like insulation and our bench tops. It was like I had to do all the research myself as the homeowner in terms of what was safe materials for the workers who are going to be installing these things. That didn't come from the industry. That didn't come from the builders. That was something that I had to push to make sure, because I'd read that, certain types of insulation gets into your lungs and it causes damage. And then I'd read that, cutting the stone, gets into your lungs and causes damage. And I didn't want to be responsible for anybody's health impact. But I was the one that had to drive that, and I was the one that had to do the research. So I imagine having, as you say, you do it once, you do it in a very controlled environment. You set it up for the future so that you never have to do that research again. You only ever do it once and then you apply it at scale. It's just saves so much energy, time, and people's lives at the end of the day. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, you're right. And the materials you use, not just, so things like VOC, which is, the vapors and stuff that come off of whether it's paint or dust or whatever in California, you can imagine, those are very, very restricted and governed in a plant. In the field, they're not. And so it is sort of this complete inconsistency, because sure, you're outside, but if I'm a foot away and there's no wind, I might as well be inside if I'm working or painting indoors, right? And priming and all the other things. So we sort of look at it two things. One is the materials we actually use. We kind of sometimes we talk about what's inside the walls is as important as what the people who buy our homes see and experience, because we believe that, right? It's like we're not going to cut corners. That doesn't mean we're going to do expensive things that don't need, where they don't need to be expensive, obviously. And at the same time, the build quality, the integrity of the materials, how they're assembled, that matters. We're trying to build homes. We are building homes that should be around for 100 years. I mean, we've already just gotten the, I forget the association's names, but it's basically fire rating, forest fire rating in California for our homes.
Big deal for California.
We haven't invested the time to get an actual passive house rating for our first home, but we've been working with Passive House, also Living Building Challenge, the LBC, and our home, we're pretty certain would be able to be Passive House rated, and we will work with them and do that to get the actual certification. One of the things we think about is, at the end of the day, some of these certifications, I think, I'm not going to name any, but maybe aren't, they sort of, I won't call it greenwashing, but sort of really what matters is how much carbon does the house use, how much does it emit, and how much was used to build it. From my perspective, and of one, and I'm no expert, that's the stuff that really matters. And that's what we're focusing on, not the badges or the certifications or whatever, but what's the real impact? Because at the end of the day, that like I said, that's what I think matters. And you can be smart about the materials you use. Unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of these materials and approaches do cost more. And so some of that we can, that's value that the end consumer will pay for. And some is just, we think the right thing to do. And we need to find ways to take cost out elsewhere and be able to do those things.
Right. Yeah. And, one has to hope that that's a relatively temporary. When I say temporary, I mean just a matter of, maybe 5 to 10 years or something before that those prices come down significantly, as you say, as more people, more companies, more businesses, more owners, more innovators jump on board the green train, right?
That we're seeing that happen. The other thing, and again, I don't want to get into carbon credits and the like, but a lot of pricing for materials and processes today doesn't reflect their true cost, right? It's just the short-term cost, not the up and down the supply or value chain or down the time component to say, what's the actual impact to this?
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Unfortunately, that's not reflected. That cost is still going to be borne, right? It's going to be borne by somebody else, somehow else.
Yeah, somewhere down the line.
Somebody else's generation.
Absolutely. So that's actually a great segue into my next question, and we've talked about this quite a lot. I wanted to make the point that the value proposition for the homeowner is very clear from a cost and timing perspective. But from the environmental impact, we've talked about it being carbon negative. And I think it's pretty clear from this conversation what that's, or at least what that roughly means. But just to be very explicit about it, what does that mean? And how does Aro plan to achieve that?
Yeah. So the way we define carbon negative operationally, right? So let's start with that. So in the actual operation of the home, running the home day to day as a homeowner, we define carbon negative as the home generates more energy than it uses.
Right.
So its net impact on our carbon footprint in operationally is negative. Yeah. It's actually, in essence, it's not really removing carbon, but it's generating energy that is from a renewable resource. And there's several ways to do that. One is to just have a boatload of PV and offset a really inefficient home, which some people do, right? Sure, I could have 20 kilowatts of solar on a roof and whatever. I know a lot of other people agree that isn't the smartest way to do it. So it's a combination for us of a really efficient package with high R value insulation, really good construction, a really low HERS rating. In other words, the house is very, very tight envelope. So how much air ingress and egress is, it's very low. So when you're heating or cooling, you're managing, you're keeping as much of that energy in the home as you can. The use of heat pumps and other things that I mentioned, just efficient HVAC systems, low voltage lighting or LED lighting, a really efficient electric water heater and appliances. Those are all the things. So you add in all those things, say, hey, how can we create an amazingly livable home, super enjoyable to live in, great lighting, great ambient air temperature control and all the rest of it, and do it with as little energy usage as possible, right? So that's thing one. And then thing two is the solar, as I mentioned at the beginning. And that's where we've netted out to, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's about the equivalent of about 2 or 3 negative tons a year of carbon emission from the home. So instead of an average home, whatever in the US, of doing something like 11 tons of carbon a year, we're doing negative 2 or 3. Obviously, depending on the specific family's electric usage, how much PV we generate, et cetera. But that's a baseline average that we're modeling against. And then the other piece is, okay, what was the total carbon used or expended to build the home? And that can be obviously a very exhaustive. You go all the way downstream, and we try to like, hey, everything from the supply chain, the energy and the carbon used to build the wires and the appliances and the rest of it, all the way to, hey, actually using wood in the home is a good thing, right? That's an offset, the more wood we use. A metal roof is actually a pretty decent carbon footprint material. We have a standing seam metal roof in our home. It's 70-year lifetime value or whatever, 70-year duration. So replace, they don't even factor this in, but instead of having to replace 2 or 3 shingle roofs over that 70 years, we're going to have the same metal roof that can actually, the metal can be recycled afterwards if somebody decides they want a different roof. So it's really factoring in all those components to say, hey, what's the carbon footprint of the home just standing there once it's done?
Yeah.
And that's how we get to this notion of, okay, well, every year we're generating a couple, 3 tons of negative. We're removing the equivalent of a couple, 3 tons of carbon. And when does that offset the home's carbon footprint? And for us, for the first home, it's about between 15 and 20 years. It's about 16 years. And we hope over time to get to around 5. And there's very few homes in the world that are sort of normal livable homes in a neighborhood you or I might visit that are at that level. And one of the things I didn't realize is how bad concrete is. Concrete's one of the worst offenders.
Yeah, the worst.
So we're actually looking at things like helical piles and alternative foundations that are seismically sound, environmentally sound, and practical.
And there is some technology coming up or being developed around embedding carbon in the concrete as well, right?
There is carbon sequestration in concrete and other sort of concrete alternatives are absolutely being explored, and that's great. There's just nothing that we know of that's commercially viable today, right, or economically viable for us. But we absolutely would love to take advantage of that when it comes available. And as I said, there's other solutions. I mean, you can use things like, particularly if you don't need a basement, which most homes don't. You don't need a lot of concrete in the home. No. If you can do something like a helical pile.
Yeah. It's going to evolve massively, I imagine, in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I hope so. And things like heat pumps. In the U.S., it's still not a lot of, it's more and more new home builds. And even though there's tax credits for retrofitting heat pumps, and they're not perfect for every climate or every geography, but we are way behind, I think, if you compare to surely Europe, the incidence of heat pumps being used. And it's growing. More and more is happening, which is great. But there's a lot of progress to be made there.
Yeah, it's exciting. I want to change direction a little bit and talk a little bit about the Aro Homes investors. So you've received $21 million in funding led by Innovation Endeavors, which you mentioned before. They're the venture capital firm co-founded by Google CEO Eric Schmidt. And so listening to you explain the model, it seems very obvious why this would attract VC capital. But do you have any other thoughts, or could you share any more on why you think VC investors would be interested in a concept like Aro Homes?
Yeah, it's been an interesting period to be starting a company, obviously, with the changes in interest rates, the sort of drying up of venture capital, the changes in the real estate market, et cetera. So very interesting time. And we think a great time to be starting this business because there's lots of things that make it very attractive. One of them we talked about earlier is the duration that we hold a property. Typical real estate, particularly residential projects, which are small, right? They're building a single family home, but the duration is a couple of years. And a lot of companies, the iBuyers in the United States, the Open Doors and OfferPads, et cetera, they felt this big time in the last year and a half when interest rates, everything was just going up for the last 10 years, previous to 2 years ago. And interest rates were low. And so there wasn't a lot of downside. But then as the market turned, interest rates going up, real estate prices stopped going up. You're sitting there holding on to all these assets that are declining in value and your interest rates are going up. And our model is is very insulated from those market dynamics because we will only be in the market for 90, 120 days. And real estate markets don't change that fast unless something really bad is happening, in which case we've got other problems. So one of the key things is duration in the market. The other is there's very few places to invest that truly can have a material impact on, unless you're building renewable energy plants and facilities like solar, wind, geo, to have an impact, and particularly something as big as we said, 23% of global greenhouse emissions. So for investors who do want to put their investors' money to work in things that are actually helping the environment, we think we're very attractive there. And then another dimension is just the return on invested capital, because we're turning our properties that we buy and then sell over several times in a year, as opposed to once every couple of years. And we're going to be able to do it at a higher gross margin once we hit some scale. The return on investment for any capital that we use, but we won't be using equity capital for the property development. It'll be more sort of capital markets debt. But that's much higher. So it's a higher return on invested capital and lower risk because of the duration. So those are a few of the reasons why we think it's attractive, and what we're hearing from investors why it's interesting and attractive. And it's such a big market. So, like I said, when we get to 1,000 homes a year, that would be a multi-billion-dollar business, frankly, which sounds weird saying it out loud, but that's what the math. That's assuming we can execute. That's where we'll get to, and that's a tiny drop in the bucket of this market. So there's just a lot of dynamics about it, a lot of things about it that make it pretty interesting. And it's not a long shot, right? It's not a crazy moonshot bet in a lot of ways, because people are building homes every day, right? It's a known thing, and we know there's a market to sell them, because we in Mountain View, I think the average price for a new home on the market that goes on market is the average time on market is something like 8 days. And they sell at a premium about 12% to 15% over an older home. So and we'll know in September when we sell our first home, but we suspect we're not going to have any problem selling our homes. It's just a low risk thing. So it really comes down to execution risk, which we're demonstrating through what we've already done and what we'll do over the next several quarters, that it's doable.
It sounds very compelling. I think it's a very exciting time to be an ambitious entrepreneur in the sustainability space. The amount of dry powder that's sitting in PE and VC land that's aimed at impact and sustainability or climate tech. It's it's an exciting time.
Yeah, and particularly with what's going on this summer with all the heat and the fires and everything else.
Right.
I mean, if hopefully people are, we're all waking up a little bit, unfortunately to the reality, but the timing of what we're doing, we think is also just because the growing awareness and reality of the situation that we're in is I think very timely as well.
Yeah, and it made me think of another facet of your value proposition to owners is not just you're doing the responsible thing from a home ownership perspective, but also from a resilience perspective, going into a very unstable future. We're going to have fires, we're going to have grids being down, we're going to have all kinds of things. Having that sort of semi off grid type home where you can rely on what you produce is going to be very attractive, with no gas and so on as well, I think. So it's just feels like a no-brainer. If I was a VC investor, I would invest for sure, Carl.
Well, that's great. We'd like that.
So to start closing off, what advice, and sort of building on what we've just been talking about from an entrepreneurial perspective, but what advice would you have for an aspiring, mission-focused entrepreneur who really wants to solve these human and environmental problems and get funding to help them do it?
Boy, I'm not sure I feel particularly qualified to answer that question. However, having lived it recently, I can share the things that have been really, really central to what we focused on in the last 18, 24 months, and what I think why we've been this successful so far. And frankly, the first is really about culture and purpose. So understand, being really clear and honest with yourself and the founding team about why you're doing what you're doing and what it's going to take to do it. I've worked in we have a co-founding team actually of about 9 people. So there's three co-founders, and then we have a founding team, people we brought in who were working with us before it was actually, we got all of our funding, and they're all owners as founding owners. And we all agreed one of the things that drew us together was alignment around the kind of company we wanted to create. Obviously what we're doing, but how we're doing it, how we treat each other, the role we play in the communities in which we operate, how we challenge and sort of operate together, how we support each other. Those, and it may sound the softer stuff, and I think it was Michael Porter who said, culture eats strategy for lunch. I've experienced that. I've worked in, places like Amazon and places that had much less effective cultures. And so thing one for me would be about culture. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is about really sort of being rigorous around understanding the things that can go wrong and why people, and in our case, we're doing something that people have tried before, versions of it. And some have been successful, but most haven't. Most famously, Katera. Obviously, it was a different business doing commercial and other stuff. But famously, they raised a couple $2 billion and ended up folding 2 years ago. So being really clear about what are the things that could go wrong, and anticipating, okay, if that does, what would I do? What can you do? Do you have resiliency in your, not just but in your business model, not just your purpose, your mission, whatever, but in the business model? Is there room for different approaches, for what the famous pivot in Silicon Valley speak, right? And really being thoughtful about those up front and being aware of them when they're starting to happen, because invariably they will. Nobody can anticipate everything unfolding exactly as you plan, 2 years out. And the third thing I say is just be a little bit humble and realistic about, we've all seen those, particularly now thinking about, investing and the VC charts and pitch decks, and everything's up and to the right. And, I'd love to, I don't know that anybody's ever done an analysis of like, okay, go back, for even the most successful companies, how did they actually compare 5 years in compared to what they said they were going to do on year one? And so I think just realism, or let's say ambition, and really big, hairy ambition, tempered with some humility and reality, can be really valuable. So those would be the couple, 3 things I'd mention.
Love those. And in a similar vein, but very much intended to be much broader in perspective, and one question we ask everybody who joins us on the show: if you could have one message or piece of advice truly heard by every single person on the planet, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. I should have known you were going to ask me that. So it's easy for me that you can make a difference. Mm-hmm. Even just a little bit you do, it does matter.
Yeah.
And I'm not the first person probably I know I'm not, to express that sentiment. But if we all did that just a little bit, man, that's 7.5 billion people doing a little bit. That's a lot. So
adds up pretty quick.
Yeah. Just like the cars, like my one car doesn't make a big difference. I used 1 gallon of gas, however many BTUs that is, to drive my wife to the airport the other day. And I was thinking about it, I was like, do you know how much energy there is in a gallon of gas? It's a lot.
a lot.
My one car isn't that much. But then you look down the highway and you think about, I don't know the number, but there has to be close to 1 billion cars out there in the world. That's a lot of cars.
It's a hell of a lot of cars, yeah. Makes a big difference. All those little changes.
That adds up. 1 billion cars adds up, or 800 million, or whatever the number is. Doesn't matter. It's large.
Yeah, absolutely. So finally, Carl, how do folks support Aro Homes, whether as a prospective investor, a homeowner, or those who just want to follow along the journey?
Yeah, so we're very early in our days. We haven't been out there promoting what we've been doing, partly because we're sort of a bit of our philosophy is let's show versus say. But that's starting to happen, right? Our first home, as I mentioned, is going to be sold. It's almost finished in a few weeks. So personally, I'd say, hey, keep an eye on the news that comes out about Aro Homes. But more importantly, being aware of and embracing and engaging with this general topic of how important some of the sort of things we take for granted about just our houses, what a big impact they have. And we don't see it, we don't know it because nobody's talking about it, frankly. And humans, my belief, and I think I have data behind it, is we really are bad at looking at long-term stuff. We're really good at near-term threat assessment. We're wired for that. But the thing that's hard to see and feel and understand that's going to happen 5 or 10 years from now, we really are not good at it. And the reality, it is happening, right? It's happening, as we mentioned before, with all the stuff we're all doing every day. And, I still drive a gas-powered vehicle, so I'm not suggesting, hey, oh my God, everybody's got to change their habits immediately. That's not real. That's not practical. And just being more aware and engaging with the increasing amount of data and information that's coming out, and then just do a little bit, right? That's the one thing I'd ask. Do a little bit.
Sound advice. Carl, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us a glimpse into this amazing future of home building. I'm so excited to follow along this journey. Having been through it myself, it's just so inspiring for me. And we wish you and your team all the very best to continue to disrupt this mammoth industry.
Thanks so much. And it was a pleasure sharing a little bit about what we're doing. And I hope that a year from now, we can talk about the many, many homes we've built and how much progress we've been making.
Let's do that. We'll lock it in. Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
Thank you, as always, for joining us for this episode. We found this one particularly pertinent and really quite inspirational. We hope you enjoyed it too, and would love to hear about what you think over on the socials. You can find the links for those on our website, sustainablejungle.com. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.